Well, hello everybody. This is Mitt Joyner, and I think we're live right now. It says we're live. So Aaliyah is going to take everyone off and just put me on, and then I'll have all my guests come back. But hi, everybody. My name is Mitt Joyner, president of NASW. I wanted to thank you for joining me on these essential chats with Mitt. I want to give us an opportunity. I've over the last since January, we've had several chats. So we came up with an idea that would allow you to participate. So if you have a topic or someone that you would like me to have on an essential chat with Mitt, please email your ideas to media@socialworkers.org. Now, if your topic gets selected, we're going to give you an opportunity to go to the NASW conference for free. So please think about what topics you'd like to hear. Join the contest. Throw us your ideas. If your ideas get accepted, we'll put you in a hat, and then we're going to have three people who will be able to participate at the upcoming NASW virtual conference for free. So I want to ask you to do that. The other thing that I wanted to kind of tell you about is this morning I happened to notice that a lot of children are getting sick with the COVID virus. There is a national vaccine campaign that we would like all of you social workers to go out and think about explaining to our community the need to get vaccinated before July the 4th. So it is a campaign that NASW has joined in, which is going to be a national vaccine campaign to get more people to get shots in their arm before July the 4th. Remember, you're not doing it for yourself. We're doing it for the children. There are many children who cannot get vaccines. There are many people who cannot get vaccines because we also know that at this time, there are some people who are sick, have to wait the 90 days to get the vaccine. So do your part to change things. Well, this is an essential chat with Mitt, and you always know that I start with a song. And the song that I picked today was going back to Stevie Wonder, We Haven't Done Nothing. The words on that song are, we are amazed, but not amused, by all the things you say that you'll do, though much concerned, but not involved, with decisions that are made by you. But we are sick and tired of hearing your song, telling how you're going to change right from wrong. Because if you really want to hear our views, you haven't done nothing. It's not too cool to be ridiculed. You brought this upon yourself. The world is tired of pacifiers. We want the truth and nothing else. Yeah, we're sick and tired of hearing your song, telling how you're going to change right from wrong. Because if you really want to hear our views, you haven't done nothing. It's been a year since the murder of George Floyd. It's been 1 year. And even though George Floyd, Derek Chauvin was charged, there's been numerous other people that have died at the hands of the police. Our Congress hasn't done nothing to get that George Floyd bill passed. In fact, it's quite the opposite of what's occurring in America. What's occurring in America since Black Lives Matter took to the streets and over 12 million people around the globe protested, our voice now is being silenced. Remember that poem, they were going to come for you? Well, in the United States, they've come for blacks, but because you're not black, you didn't do anything. They've come for Latinos, but because you're not Latino, you didn't do anything. They've come for transgendered people, but because you are not transgendered, you don't do anything. They've come for women, But because some of our people, those in power, are not women, they don't do anything. And they've come for Asians, Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, and our indigenous tribal people. But because you're not from those groups, you haven't done nothing. Okay, social work. It's no longer time for us to sit around and have debates. It is time for us to take action. So I decided to ask Gary Bailey to join me as my co moderator and have a nice discussion with our leaders of color. And I say that our leaders of color that represent social work. And as they went through this last year, they've had their own personal reactions. I know I've had mine. I do all of this volunteer work to build a better nation for my grandsons. And it kills me every time I see a young person murdered with no kind of any for any reason at all, because I'm so fearful that that can happen to my grandson or to some other people that I love. And then I look at the border and I see that the conditions of the border, maybe social workers cannot stop people from coming to the border, but we sure can improve the conditions that people live in. It is our moral obligation to do so. And we do see the Asian American, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. They're under attack. And it takes our responsibility. If we, Gary, built coalitions, all of these coalitions, do you know how effective we could be? So I say, as my experience as president of NASW, and what I am saying right now are Mitt's words, not NASW's words, that it is time for a paradigm shift. This thing that social workers here to always help those who are vulnerable and everybody pick what they want to pick, those days are over. Social justice is so critical to what we all do because it doesn't just uplift African Americans and all the groups that I've talked about, it uplifts everyone. And the role of social work, as I tell everybody, I've read the papers of Whitney Young, and he was a strategist. He went with A. Philip Randolph, John Lewis, Martin Luther King, and had a whole movement on jobs and freedom. Why I think social workers need to understand their history. They need to understand why we evolved and what was the purpose of us evolving. And we can't get lost in the fact that I just have a private practice and that's all I care about. Yes, you care about that, but you have a responsibility to uplift America. So I understand that, but as a leader, I am ready to take action. I am ready for our voice to be heard, our collective voice to be heard. What's your thoughts on that, Gary?
Mitt, it's as always, it's just such a pleasure to be able to share space with you and to have these kinds of conversations, which we have more often than I think either one of us would really want to have, particularly about social injustice. Paulo Freire had said that, it's interesting, we can study a problem. He was talking about social workers, and we're really good about studying problems. We look at them every which way, but I would argue sometimes the right way, but we really interrogate the problem. Freire said, then you want to look at the context in which the problem exists, so that we look at the socioeconomic factors. We look at the language we now use about the social determinants of health, which I refer to as the social factors of health. Determinants to me sound very fixed. Factors are remediable and malleable, and so language matters. And so we stay in those spaces so that we're examining and we're thinking about the context. Freire says, then you have to act, you have to do something. And I don't know that we're as good about taking action and getting involved and engaged in making change. And what has struck me over this past year is how many social work colleagues that I have had here in the great Commonwealth of Massachusetts and across the country who will say to me that they have been surprised by what's happening in the country. And I kind of pull back and I look at them and I think, well, we've had the same education, have worked in the same communities and with the same populations. How are you surprised that racism is endemic in this country, that sexism, anti-Semitism, ageism, transphobia, transmesia, that all of these things are alive and well in this nation, and yet be surprised at what's happening. Well, the time to be surprised has now passed. This has been the year. This has been the window of being able to stand behind a banner that says, "I wasn't aware. I'm surprised at how deep things are as it relates to white supremacy and patriarchy and misogyny." And we can go on and on and on about it. Um, but for me, for Gary Bailey, that window, that door is now shut, because at this point, you're no longer surprised. Here's the evidence. So, what are you going to do now that you're no longer surprised? And that the path to liberation is around action. That when we look at developmental theory, we look at information being fed to us and the ways in which we take that data in. It creates a level of cognitive dissonance, uses Frantz Fanon's work. But after we've sat in that space of cognitive dissonance, we make some choices. We either stay in the path to maintain the status quo, or we're going to go on the path to liberation. We don't always know where that's going to lead, but we have to do something. And so Stevie Wonder was right. We are at a point where if we don't do something, then we continue to do nothing. And so it's time for us to get actively engaged and actively involved. As president of the National Association of Social Workers Insurance Services, Inc., which is the NASW insurance company, one of the things that I felt I had to do as its president was to engage our boards and to then speak to our members and our clients, our customers, about what our position was around race equity through a business lens, because that's what we are. We're an insurance company coming out of the National Association of Social Workers. And then how do we lead, not only by making a statement, but by the actions that we're taking as part of our insurance enterprise? And I'm really delighted to be able to say that we were ahead of the curve of what now is happening in industries as people are making statements, me performative, no question. But then there are those who are living into those statements as well. And so I want to see more of that. That's what I want to see next.
Well, we have a bunch of leaders with us, and as the stars aligned, and sometimes I always think that the higher power brought with us a lot of leaders of color heading up social work organizations. So Gary, let's talk to all of them, and let's hear what they have to say and get their personal reflections as well as how they incorporated change into their organization. So I want to invite Dr. Sandra Starks, who is the board chair of the Council on Social Work Education, because that's where it all begins. The question that I want them all to think about and think about seriously is how we are the gatekeepers of social work. We don't want to wake up one day and have someone leading our organization that does not believe in social justice. So, what is the role of gatekeeping in social work? So, Dr. Starks, can you get us started?
I can, and thank you. And I'm so excited to be here with all of you. Thanks again to Mitt, to President Joyner and her NASW team for putting this together, and for all my fellow panelists for being such supportive collaborators in this movement around racial injustice and systemic racism. We were asked first. I'm Sandra Starks, chair of the board of directors for CSWE and full professor and MSW program director at Western Kentucky University. And we were asked by Mitt to respond to or reflect on the death of George Floyd and what our responses were this past year from a personal and a professional organizational perspective. Well, personally, this whole year of trauma, just the brutality, the violence, the murder, I'm a child of the 60s, so it was re-traumatizing for me, and an opportunity to do one of the things Gary has said about before. I've heard Gary Bailey say difficult conversations have to shift to courageous conversations. So having so many of these over this past year until you're just exhausted and tired, going through the whole grief process, but realizing, no, there's work to be done. And you bring a history, I bring a history, we all bring a history to this movement. So professionally at CSWE, we heard and we felt the pain, and we heard the calls and demands from our students, our faculty across the nation, that we need to re-examine what's happening within our own wheelhouse. What are we doing or not doing? And basically, one of my colleagues said, you know what, it has to start with cleaning up our own house. And we were so in agreement with that. So the CEO, Darla Coffey, and I began to think about ways with other colleagues about what do we need to do beyond the traditional statement that we normally put up from CSWE. And so basically we came up with, let's pull together this task force of leaders, thought leaders from across the nation who are practitioners, social work practitioners, educators, and let's pull them into charge them with this anti-racism approach to looking at what needs to change at CSWE across the board. So we were able to engage and get the agreement of two wonderful leaders to spearhead the movement, Dr. Yolanda Padilla, who chairs our Center for Racial Injustice and Diversity, and Dr. Tracy Whitaker, who's Vice Dean at Howard University. So there was representation from HBCUs, PDIs across the nation, rural, urban, that spoke to. In fact, we had a team of over 40 members participating in this. So that we were doing more than just denouncing racism and violence and disparities, which we all know, we all speak that language. So our thinking was bring this amazing team together, and out of that develop the areas of, let's look at curriculum, letting those people who wanted to focus on the curriculum, because we know, are we teaching to what our communities, are we preparing our students to work in the world of today? Are we giving them the right tools? Are we using the right information, the right research that's addressing the issues of people of color particularly, and marginalized people? No, the answer was no, we know we're not, but what are we doing about it? And then the second category was looking at conferences and faculty development, because many of our faculty will tell you, and not just our predominantly white faculty who will tell you, I don't know how to teach to that content. But many of our faculty of color, if they're honest, don't know how to teach because they were brought up in a different paradigm. So looking at how we're presenting conferences and faculty development, and then looking at faculty, student, racial equity, and ethnic equity. What do our classrooms really look like in terms of who's teaching this content, and what are our student makeup look like? And most important to many people, what do our accreditation standards look like? Yeah, and perfect timing because we're right in the revision for the 2022 EPAS standards. So a wonderful opportunity to make sure anti-racism content and how we're going to measure that is infused into those documents. And so we talked before we went live about a response from one of our schools across the nation who immediately decided, based on what they thought the accreditation standards were going to say, that they could no longer be in compliance based on what we believe. And when I say we, what social workers believe, what we're supposed to believe about inclusion and diversity and equity. And so because of that, they chose to remove their School of Social Work. So I'm glad that we've mobilized around that. We have a statement on the CSWE website that you can go to and read the information, because they're not the first and they won't be the last. This is the beginning of more of what we're up against. And so I'm so grateful that we are being collaborative in our approach. I tried to get a lot into a little bit. In closing, let me just say that we're currently in phase 4 of the development and implementation of the recommendations from our task force. We rolled out the preliminary recommendations and findings at APM last year, and we've already begun to divide up the areas that CSWE can begin to immediately make change, and then what areas are going to take longer. So I'm really pleased and proud. Is there more work to be done? Yes. Do we need more input and feedback? Yes. But what we really need is support and the voices of, we're in this together and we make the change. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for leading. Thank you for leading, because often people do not say thank you, dear leaders. They want us to keep doing more, 24 hours a day, right, Luis? So we will have you kind of tell us what's happening at SWR,
I swear, very
right,
well.
and with you.
Thank you very much for inviting me today. At SWR, we're trying to keep up with the times, of course, and stay ahead. Uh, our conferences have focused on racial injustice. The themes for the past 2 years and the upcoming conference are still on issues of racial justice, social injustice, and violence too, we might add. And we are trying to make that theme cut across all American groups, right? Regardless of one's ethnicity and race, but rather that we're seeing too much of the intolerance and the violence perpetrated on all of us and different people. One of the things that we're proud of is that our journal has really taken lots of steps to make sure that the content, the methodologies, the concepts that are presented in the papers that appear in the journal will reflect the makeup of the population, a definition of race and ethnicity, so that we are reading papers that have a basic set of principles by which they are written. It's interesting too that only recently that the Journal of the American Medical Association take note that race is a factor, and it took the perhaps the intemperate words of one person in some kind of podcast to really get that going. But why did it take so long? It really takes me back to Dr. Bailey's point, right? When you talk to our colleagues and they're realizing what's happened in this country, well, as social workers, where have you been? What even brought you to the profession if it wasn't something like that? Which gets me a little bit more towards my own experience this past year and my professional experience, seeing what's happened to George Floyd, to numerous Black Americans who have been shot, beaten, made to feel like they don't belong with, living while Black, right? Park or in your apartment building foyer or wherever it might be, but seeing how the intolerance of people and our government is being applied all across the kind of the landscape. And so, as you know, and others, my area has been immigration and asylum-seeking families, families held in detention, and more recently, these unaccompanied minors. Well, the injustice is there, the brutality is there, the way they were treated. It's no wonder that they are now coming in large numbers because they've been sitting on the border for so long under the previous administration, and these children are seeking help. What's interesting is that not just Latinos. They are, after all, made up of many nationalities. They come from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, though the preponderant numbers are, of course, from Central America. But in a recent visit to a refugee camp for children, I saw Afro-Latinos from Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Colombia, and of course, Haiti, were coming into this country through the border. So we know that it will be an injustice to them, not just because of their immigrant status, but by the color of their skin and the sound of their speech. I mean, that is going to be continuing, and we've got to fight it. One of the troubles I have, again, going back to Dr. Bailey's point, is that too many of our students these days are more concerned with their own safety than the safety of those out there. They're more concerned with, the pandemic and what that's done to their learning. Admittedly, it's not an unimportant problem. It's significant. But I think we have to separate our needs and what we consider hardship to really see about the hardships of the people who are being brutalized, whether it's George Floyd and his family and the young woman who took that video, who was traumatized by it, and the gentleman who spoke to Chauvin later, and the trauma when he spoke at the trial and wept. I think we're seeing it all over, and if our students think of their hardship as greater than those hardships, I think we as a profession and as educators have a long way to go to change the way we teach and how we teach it. So it's more than just courageous conversations. It's more than handling these difficulties in the classroom, but it's really having students think harder about what they're going to face in our profession. One last thing before I turn it over to you, and that is, as I get older, I can say whatever I want. This I'm speaking for myself, not for Swerve, but it's the idea that we have to that our students are needing to be prepared for the encounters that they're going to have. Well, those trigger warnings don't happen in real life. We can create a safe space for you at the university, but when you're out there working, nobody's going to tell you that today you're going to be handed a severely abused child, or that your client's brother or sister committed suicide. I think we have to develop thicker skin and more learning for our students. I'll stop there.
Go ahead,
Dr.
Gary.
Stark, I couldn't agree more. And I'm not of the. I understand the need for us to be able to hold people and create an environment, a holding environment that people can process through. But also, the world doesn't create holding environments for the people we process with. And so we have to be, and it's starting where our clients are. And so our clients start in trauma, then we stand with them in that trauma, and not necessarily with the protections that so many people feel that they should have to be able to do the work. Thank you so much for that comment. Dr. Gale, you are on the front lines at BPD and in Savannah, working with students at the baccalaureate, so that you're getting that group that's coming in who are coming straight from high school into college. Can you talk a little bit about how this is showing up for that next generation, the Zillennials, I'm hearing them referred to now as that generation? I'm curious how that's showing up for you.
Well, thank you, Gary, for segueing from that perspective, because we are seeing our students who are coming in through our volunteer programs, and we have conversations with them, and we broach the conversation around George Floyd, and you can actually look at the trauma and the not being able to speak the way they want to speak, fear that if they come together in groups that they will be pounced on by law enforcement, and also trying to get them to segue from the high school, and you're now coming to the college level. So there are certain kinds of things that we need to teach you as it relates to when you go out there into the world of work, as Louis was saying earlier. My trauma has been coming from many aspects. My mother is still alive, so I get an opportunity to go and see her when I leave from work. And one of our conversations, or usually a conversation, is around CNN, because she's watching and she's had a diet of that all day. And so I've had to come and help desensitize her to what had occurred that day. And we've got her to the point where she's not going to look at it as much as she used to, but she does.
Mm-hmm.
And it also takes me back to the fact that, as Dr. Stark says earlier, I'm a child of the 60s, and I remember when Martin Luther King was killed. I remember when our streets, buildings were vandalized. I remember the fires. Also, my mother, when we were children, she took us on a bus ride, and she was forced to get up out of her seat for a Caucasian American. And that was an issue for us as children. And so a lot of times you see people and you really don't know what they've gone through in their life, and you wonder why they respond to certain things and how they respond to those things. And a lot of times it's because they've had history with it. And I think that because of what has happened to George Floyd and the others, because there's a list of others,
Right.
but we have to be responsible. We have to think about the whole picture, because I'm in Savannah, and down the road is Brunswick, where Ahmaud was murdered, and just certain things that happen. Um, I like the song by the Temptations called A Ball of Confusion. As a child, I just thought it was a beautiful song and we used to dance to. But as I got older, then I started, I read the lyrics to it. Apologize, lights going out there. And I read the lyrics to it, and if I can encapsulate from that time up until now, we are still in the 60s. Everything is just more beautiful now. We have more access of what we think we have to things. In reality, that's being pulled back. And so when I think about it overall, how I have been poised to be the leader at this point is that I take it to faculty. Faculty are really on point as to how they are dealing with it and how they're dealing with their students, because we have a MSW program as well. So many of our students, we have the advanced standard program, and many of them are going out into the field and they're working, and we're getting calls back from them telling us, Dr. Gail, you didn't tell us that when they allow us to come in with our MSWs, that they were still going to be racist toward us. So it's the, helping them to deal with the fact, okay, you got a good job now, but yes, we may not want you to be here. And so that's one of the things that we are working with from the academic perspective. We're actually looking at changing our field placement around, so that in the beginning we would have more of a seminar starting earlier as opposed to when they get in the field. So we can start teaching them those kinds of things, soft skills, as well as how you deal with working out into the community. And as the president of BPD, we've been kind of like in a revitalization, if you will, a new change mode. Our main concept, or our main mantra here is moving forward. Our next conference will be next year. We'll have it in New Orleans. And one of our main focus is to deal with the issues behind our racial injustices. And so I think that this is an excellent opportunity that Dr. Joyner has allowed us to come here today to share, because we wear the hats as being leaders, but we're really dealing with some issues. And we're in the fire, so to speak, because now the covers have been pulled off. And people are no longer able to hide behind their isms. And those of us who are empowered, you have to call those isms out to the carpet.
Right.
And so this opportunity for us to share today, I think it strengthens us to let us know we need to keep doing what we're doing, and we need to be very supportive. I want to pass it on to Martell, Dr. Teasley. He is I'm so proud of my brother as being the president of national organizations, NAD, National Association of Deans and Directors. And this is his second term being president. So that lets us know that my opinion, that he's doing a good job. But I want to introduce Martell and ask him what his thoughts are around the question.
Well, thank you. Let me see. Am I muted? Can you hear me?
We hear you.
Okay. I'm Martell Teasley, and thank you for that introduction there. I'm president of the National Association of Deans and Directors. A lot of folks don't know what NAD is or does. Actually, its primary mission is to train leaders for social work education. So it is comprised of deans, directors, and department chairs throughout the country to come and have leadership training. And we meet twice a year, one day conference meeting prior to APM. And then we have a annual conference 3 days in the spring. One of the things that we've had to deal with, and this is my second term doing this, and I'm really proud of that, but it's been a labor of love. One of the things that we've been dealing with there was the development of anti-racist plan in NAD. And so when George Floyd happened, we were already in the midst of talking about this, and we write a lot of statements. And so something happens, and I usually talk to Darla Coffey, Mitt Joyner and others, representatives from the national organization. It's like, well, how are we going to respond? And, we wanted to write a letter about George Floyd. We wrote a letter about what happened with our Asian American brothers and sisters. But I said to NAD, I wrote to the membership and said, look, we're not going to be reactionary here. We're going to continue down the road of development of our anti-racist action plan. And that really coincides with what CSW is doing. It has 4 overall goals. And one of them, I'll just read them off for the goals, and they have objectives up under them. One is to engage in self-reflection and assessment as individual members of NAD and as an organization to identify and address explicit and implicit racism and white supremacy, lack of awareness of intersectionality, and lack of inclusion in our structures and interactions. Secondly, build leadership capacity centered on anti-racist practices and policies in social work, higher education, and support and promote the development of new Black, Indigenous people of color leaders within the profession. I'll just stop right there. There are 2 other larger goals, and so you get the drift there. And we're about doing that. And we also have LAD, which is the Leadership Academy for Deans and Directors. We normally take in 11 or 12 folks for a 15-month cycle. And we're changing the curriculum there to anti-racist practices and training leaders in understanding structural inequalities and microaggressions within social work education and practice. And so those are some things that we're doing there. But we also have taken on the challenge with the Association of Social Work Boards, ASWB, and what I refer to as Jim Crow licensing, where the licensing is not about what is going on in Black communities, or Latinx communities, or Native American communities. It's strictly a test that is very mainstream, with very mainstream ideals and questions. And for one to pass it, and I passed it myself, I gave my license up years ago, one has to comport or stop thinking about how they are as a people within their community and answer it as a mainstream practitioner. That works well for many, but it doesn't work for the masses of people. So we've challenged them. I've been in contact with the CEO, Dwight Hicks. He wrote me recently wanting to meet with me. We've been meeting for over a year now. They're calling for a summit to look at the testing. One, they will probably have a survey, a national survey, and they're going to invite constituent organizations. NAD would have representation. I would imagine NASW will have representation as well as CSWE. And the survey will be designed to go out to practitioners who have license as well as those who don't have license. And so, but beyond that, we're still pushing. We're meeting with the ACLU now and some organizations because we may try to, in fact, sue this organization because it is a 501c3 organization and it should have open records. And as a conservative, Ronald Reagan said, truth through verification. There is no revealing of the psychometric properties of their test. And so we don't know how it holds up in terms of either analysis or whether it's valid or not. They say it is, they need to release it. And when anyone gets the data, all you get is the percentage of people who are passing. You will not get demographic data about how many people are passing of different backgrounds. And that's really a shame in the 21st century in the information age. We can get all types of data, but we can't get this basic data from a major social work organization. So in my mind's eye, in many ways, all of our organizations should take this organization on. We can't play nice with people who are doing these types of things because it's hurting people, it's hurting communities, and it's hurting practitioners. We have Melissa Haley here. NABSW, the National Association of Black Social Workers, broke away from social work 60 years ago because it said that if you start this licensing, you will have nothing in there about Black communities, and they were right, and they're still right. And so we have a mainstream organization outside of what we do in our national meetings because of not being included, and well, they should have. More recently, I've advocated, as well as Dr. Starks and others, as well as Mitt Joyner, for inclusion of NABSW into the Leadership Roundtable, which is sponsored by the Council on Social Work Education and the CEO, Darla Coffey. But, you know, those conversations are really tough. We talk about inviting people, and then when we said, hey, let's invite NABSW, folks started saying, well, what's the criteria for admission? You know, so all of a sudden we start talking about criteria when before that it was just, oh, let's invite this people, let's invite this group, and let's invite that group. but it became quite different and I said to the CEO of CSWE that we cannot talk about anti-racist practices when we have a major social work organization dedicated to an ethnic group that is outside of there. So our Latino folks should be a part of the table also. And again, we also have had forums on many topics. We've had a forum on what was going on at the border with Dr. Zayas. What is going on at the border is really a tragedy. It's very dehumanizing and oppressive. The people of color are not viewed as the same. They seem to be viewed different humanly, and we treat them differently. We violate our own international agreements on human rights and the housing of people in those what may really seem like concentration camps, or we're holding people down there, the immigrants. And we don't talk about the history of what happened in South America and the colonization of them, and what led to people walking hundreds of miles to the US border to escape the persecution that was going on in their countries. And so there's a lot of history to be talked about there. Let me just say for a second my own feelings about one of the questions was about how do you feel about this? I'm a military retiree, and I took the oath to serve this country. So January 6th really had an impact on me. It wasn't so much January 6th, it was really what happened after that. It was one thing to see people who call themselves patriotic beating policemen with flags. But it was another thing to see our congressional leaders who took the same oath that I did. And when I went to war for this country, you know, when you go to war, they stage the whole thing. Unless you're a paratrooper or part of a rapid deployment force, you don't leave immediately. You know, it's this whole staging thing. So you have to think about what's happening as you pack up your home, send your loved ones away. Am I going to do this? And I said to myself, yes, you took the oath and you could get killed, but you're going to go and you're going to honor this. And I went and I did honor it. I lived in the desert for a year. But to see our elected officials not stand up to that whole oath was very hurting to me. I didn't know that I would feel that way, but it was extremely hurting and extremely stressful. I did understand what was happening with the January 6th was really not something that was out of the ordinary. But if we look at the trends of what happened in Michigan, if we look at what happened in Charlottesville, we could see that this was coming and that it's not over. And so we have the business of engaging as advocates. I love the notion from Dr. Bailey that these tough conversations also have to turn into action and action plans. And so as much as I've done in trying to set the stage for what comes next as NAD, I haven't done enough. None of us have done enough. We need to keep after it. One of the things that the death of George Floyd did to me was to say, you should not be afraid to say anything anymore. When a man is on the ground begging on his life, and his brother said he was screaming for his mother, those of us who can breathe must use our breaths and our life appropriately to do something about the conditions and the context. Again, to the border, there is disparities in how people of color are treated. When our Haitian brothers and sisters come from persecution to the United States, they're sent back and repatriated immediately and put in prison. But when the white Cubans come here and just touch the water, then they become part of citizenship. And should we let the 11 million people who are quote unquote illegal aliens within our country right now become, if we let them stay here, we'll create second and third class tiers of citizenship that we've had for so long. And all of that is part of racial capitalism right there.
Thank you. You know, I'm going to take a moment and just kind of let our audience know how we're going to move. In an hour, which will be up soon, are going to shift over to two other individuals who are going to be leaders. But I'm going to ask, and I'm going to change something up a little bit. I'm going to ask that Melissa Haley stay with us when we segue over, because I want to make sure that you have the opportune time to speak as well, because you're dealing with social workers on the ground. So when everyone else leaves, Melissa, stay with us. And we'll go to Gotham right now and hear his response. Is that okay, everybody?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. I mean, this is a panel of friends and people I've known for a while, and thank you for inviting me. I'm here not only as a dean at Boston College School of Social Work, but also as the president of the St. Louis Group of Deans and Directors that are pursuing excellence in social work research and education. And this group is particularly interested in working with the NAD and the SWR and CSWE to both advance how we do the kind of social work scholarship and training of the next generation of those who are going to be engaged in research that's very relevant to the issues that we've been discussing this past 45 minutes. So we're in this moment where Ed Yong called this rare but ruinous event of the pandemic superimposed on top of a persistent 400-year-old problem of racism that continues with us. And then you then have the undercurrent of the United States of America, and this is to my friend Martel's point, that America is shifting. It's still in the making. And it's in the making with a diverse set of populations, with cultures and languages and various orientations, but all unified in something aspirational they find about America, but denied to them. And it is this confluence of ideas, clashing trends, and persistent racism, it's within which we all are operating, and so is the St. Louis Group of Deans and Directors, as well as our own respective schools of social work. I give you that because that's the context and the challenge for the St. Louis Group of Deans working with NAD and SWR. I came into the leadership position of the St. Louis Group right in the middle of the pandemic, took it over from our president, former President Luis Zayas, but we're really confronted with this new ecosystem and what happened after the murder of George Floyd. So a few things that we've begun to think about. We just had we couldn't have our regular meetings, but we just had in February a large online meeting of all of us, wherein we first began to think about, okay, in the context of COVID, how do you uncover the impacts of all of this, racism, COVID, all of these, on our social work faculty and staff and others, particularly faculty working on these issues that are central to us, that we're trying to advance as a profession. What has been the impact? And what's been the differential impact on faculty of color and students of color who are in our schools, who are the next generation, who are going to take this work forward with CSWE, with SWR, with NAD. So this is one aspect that we've begun to grapple with. Part of that is, going forward, we will have to deal with, in a very serious way, and we're going to be, is not only how do we bring in more faculty and scholars of color so that we can represent the communities that are of utmost concern to us, not just in this moment, but going forward in America. And if we are going to be, I don't like this phrase, but the majority-minority country, we are going to have to represent in all of our universities, in our institutions, in our think tanks, a very different kind of doctoral students and faculty and scholars that not instinctually understand, but can meet the communities where they are, not demand on the community that they meet where the scholar or the researcher is coming from. And I think this is partly where our problems have been. in our scholarship, where we don't see the voices of, people in the margins. So how do we bring in, both into the ranks of our faculty and into our doctoral programs, into the MSW program too, a new set of scholars and practitioners and researchers? That pipeline, how do we create? That's going to be the challenge for the St. Louis group, working with NAD, working with SWORD, working with NASW and CSWE. And here, I just want to pivot to one thing we're doing, and I want to talk about, I was part of a conversation on transformation yesterday. And I've been thinking about, what does it mean to transform ourselves now? One of them, and many of you have picked up on this idea, starting with Dr. Bailey, and others have picked up on this. If we are going to be transforming, we have to move away from euphemistic and obfuscating language. We have to call things for what they are, both in our scholarship, in our practice, and we have to train our colleagues and ourselves to have that gumption and courage to call. And that means we have to declutter. We have to declutter, and that's when transformation will happen. We have to declutter in the way we talk about our Black and brown and other communities, in our scholarship, in our practice, case studies, in our classrooms. And that kind of decluttering is not easy, but we'll have to do it. Now, one of the things we're doing here is, many of you talked about, how do we work with our Black and brown communities? We at Boston College School of Social Work have doubled down on two fronts, on our Latinx communities and our Black communities. And I think as a social work profession and as a school of social work, if we can do that with a singular focus, then we have a chance of getting someplace. And I'm not being falsely modest here. It's not going to happen in my generation, but it has to start here. And we have to gather the moss and then get there to that promised land. And last point I will make here is, so we're starting, along with our Latinx Leadership Initiative, the Black Leadership Initiative, where we want to bring cohorts of this new pipeline, and then really have, trainings and professional developments, and even the curriculum that is aligned with the communities that our students are going to graduate and go into. And one of them is also, how do we move back social work into the workplace? Because a lot of our Black and brown communities are earning a living and making their livelihoods in the workplaces, at the bottom of those workplaces. They have been the front line in COVID in hospitals. And how do we work with them? And one of the areas we're thinking about is equity, justice, and inclusion in the workplace that enables us to focus on those communities. And the faculty leading that. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And I know that our audience has questions and all of those things. I'm going to ask that Dr. Gale, I'm going to say thank you. I'm going to say thank you to Dr. Starks, Zayez, Teasley, and Gautam. I'm going to say thank you to you as well. And I do know that this is just part one. There's going to be a part 1, 2, 3, and 4. This, because I am committed into switching this paradigm. I am, as the NASW president. And while they are segueing off, I am going to ask I'm going to ask Melissa Haley, who is my friend and colleague, who's one of those people that's going to be here years later. But she works with the front line. Everyone that we talked about social work education and how we have to change and evolve. But the real reality, and one of the real realities that we must face, is that we have social workers on the front line right now and how do we work with them and help them lead this message of bending this arc. So I'm going to say goodbye to all the rest of you, and then we'll have two other people join. But Melissa, I want you now to speak and take the time to kind of talk to that vision as well.
Thank you
Melissa
all.
Haley, thank you all. Melissa Haley is the president of the National Association of Black Social Workers. And I have to say, years ago, I was at a conference that I know her father led. And so it is my privilege and honor to share this stage with you, Melissa. And please give us your synopsis as well and your feedback.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joyner. It was wonderful sitting there, listening to all the social work leaders and really interest trying to contain the rage, right? Trying to ensure, because before I'm a social worker, I'm a Black woman. I'm married to a Black man. I got Black kids. My whole unit is Black. I live in a Black community. I chose a Black life, went to Black education. And to have to hear some of the same challenges that are the reason why the National Association of Black Social Workers began. That, 53 years ago, we had to fight as Black practitioners, Black leaders, to speak on the behalf of our community. And we knew that we would have to be in self-determination in order to speak on behalf of our community and to be in safe and protected spaces. Because when you're in these organizations and institutions and you're one Black professor, right? Or you're one Black director, how difficult is it that to move the table, right? To change the table. And the only reason why I sit at the table is to turn it over, right? I'm not here to eat. I'm not here to socialize. I'm here because there's something wrong with the table. And what we have been feeding students, what we have been feeding people in the community has not been healthy, right? It has not been conducive to making the type of liberation changes. At the Millie Charles School of Social Work at Southern University, where I taught for years, that the school is about social justice. It is about liberation. It is about what can we do to make change in the community that has oppressed us. As a Black woman, I'm not a friendly visitor. I'm not Jane Addams. I didn't come here to help you. I came here to liberate my community. That's what I'm about, because when I see George Floyd die, that's my husband down there. That's my brother. And it brings about a rage that as social workers, we need to go about and invest in the change, because daily, overnight, really, and when COVID hit, it changed the way we do business. We were about engagement. We were about touching people. We're about listening to them, helping them in their most challenging times. How can we, as members of the community, help you with our knowledge and expertise to overcome whatever is oppressing you at this particular point? How can we do that? And then, just like that, we had to change the way we do business. And in the middle of COVID, while we're sitting at home trying to help people from a telehealth perspective, trying to help people social distancing, then we watch a Black man die for no reason. And so when you see a Black man dying for no reason, unlike the previous colleagues, I'm a product of the 80s. I came of age when NWA came of age. And the number one song back then when NWA came of age was Blank the Police, right? Because our relationship with the police as a Black community had been hostile for so long. And so we saw it very differently. And we saw that the way to get through it was to express our rage, to express it through song. So when you hear Stevie Wonder, you haven't done nothing, that's not. But when you hear NWA saying, look, we tired of these police, we tired of this oppression, we need liberation right now. And so as a Black social work organization, NABSW has been committed to liberation for 53 years. And we knew that we were not going to be able to get it sitting at folks' tables, that we needed to get out there and say there's racism in adoption. There is racism in social work education. It is no way that a Black student can graduate from a BSW program, go through K through 12, and not have a white instructor. It is unfortunate that we have students graduating from BSWs and MSW and has never taken a class from people of color, has never had a field placement instructor where they have to listen and learn from somebody, where they see us as clients, right? Not as liberators. So it is unfortunate that we live in this age and society. And as a Black woman whose daughter couldn't walk across the stage because of COVID-19, who couldn't, she was all right with not going to prom. But when she couldn't go to Howard University, right, that's when she said, look, I did everything I was supposed to do. So the rage was now in the house. And how do we deal with that rage? So what I say, as Dr. Bailey said, you know, NABSW, our conference this year is the Wellness Warriors. The fight calls for actions. And action is accountability, collaboration, transformation, innovation, outcomes, networking, and solutions. That's what actions are about. And so we collaborate. We're at the table to collaborate, but we want transformation. We want change. We don't want to have to keep coming to y'all. What he said, my daddy didn't get tenured at Wash U in 83. And right now, we still got people not getting tenured. And he had to sue to be liberated. And because he was wrongly terminated, because he didn't want to write about what they thought was important to get tenured. So I say all of this to say that liberation is not a spectator sport. So if you're looking at CNN thinking you about to change something, that's not going to happen. Liberation is about getting engaged, and whether you are a racist or not, because we got a whole lot of people out there who are not racist, but racism exists in this country. So if you're benefiting from racism, you are contributing to racism. So we expect our white colleagues to stand up and recognize that these disparities are not happenstance, that 50% of the jails, which are full of Black men, is not a happenstance. While 300 people have been put to death for killing white folks, but only 21 people have been put to death for killing Black people. See, that is a problem, data that exists in our community that shows you racism that penetrates and is the tapestry of this country. So the bottom line is, if you're watching CNN and you're not making change, you're a part of the problem.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you very much, Melissa. And President Jordan, may I make just a quick statement? I'm seeing something in the chat that I'm going to comment on very quickly.
Okay,
We are not going to accept or tolerate in the chat any kind of attack, either on people who are speaking or people who are dead. That is just not going to happen. It's not going to happen on my watch, and it's not going to happen on this profession's watch. So, Mr. Ken, if you don't like the conversation, feel free to remove yourself from it.
Thank you, Gary.
And don't let the door hit you.
Yes, we got to call it out. And thank you, Melissa. I want to, before we bring in Dr. Joe and Dr. Farmer, who are the next leaders. We had all of the leaders, but Dr. Farmer is now is the co-president of GAID, and Dr. Joe is the president-elect of SWER. But before we hear that, I want to hear from a dear friend and colleague, Mo Yi, who was the president of GAID. If we could just run that tape for.
This is Mo Yi Lee. I'm professor and PhD program director at the College of Social Work, Ohio State University. I'm also the president for the group for the advancement of doctoral education in social work from April 2018 to May 2021. I'm Asian American and originally from Hong Kong. Last year was a very challenging and difficult year. The racial injustice inflicted upon the Black and Brown brothers and sisters, and the recent increase in anti-Asian violence, especially after COVID, are deeply disturbing. Despite of all the contribution that the APIDA populations made to the society, we are still considered forever foreigner because of our skin color, and that is deeply frustrating. I'm the chair of the board of directors of Asian American Community Service in Central Ohio. The community is traumatized by these random acts of violence because we never know when and where it will happen to whom. Despite of all this frustration, I'm also seeing signs of hope. That is a time of crisis. In Chinese, the word crisis actually consists of two words, danger and opportunity. Yes, we are in danger of systemic and institutional racism. There are also racial tension, conflicts, intolerance, hatred, and violence within the community. On the other hand, what happened right now can also present opportunity and also a window for change. I've seen a lot of positive and constructive energy despite of frustration and anger. Gay, in June 12, 2020, issued the Gay Statement on Anti-Racism. Throughout the year, faculties and students had come together to have dialogue around anti-racist pedagogy in doctoral social work education. And students have also put together a report and recommendations to move forward. Social work leaders of the CSWE Leadership Roundtable also stand together, have town halls meetings, and also take steps in their own organization to create change. I believe the crisis we are facing now, in fact, could be a window for change. But we will need to do two things together. First, for social work organizations, we definitely need to work together to strategically and boldly identify, confront, and challenge systemic and institutional racism. There need to be accountability and clear steps. If not, we'll just be moving round and round, making noises, but not real change. Second, BIPOC, including APIDA populations, will have to support each other in this work together. The tendency to divide is strong. Let me say it again. The tendency to divide is strong, but it will only weaken what we can all do together. I'm hopeful that we can stand and collaborate together to embrace difference, seek justice, and create change that will make this place a better place for everybody. Thank you.
What a great segue, Gary. The questions that Mo Yi threw out to all of us. So I would like Dr. Farmer and Dr. Joe to kind of respond to Mo Yi's challenge. And in your vision now as new leaders coming in, how are you going to embrace the challenges that Mo Yi has thrown down? And I guess I'll start with you, Dr. Farmer, since you are taking over for Mo Yi.
Well, good afternoon, and this is has been a great opportunity to participate in this and to hear some of the insights and reflections of many of the leaders in social work education and research. As I sort of reflect on Mo Yi's comments, and have had the opportunity to work with Mo Yi over the last 4 years now as a member of GAID. The one thing that really sort of has stood out for me, and I think is going to be the guiding force as I work with my co-president, Julie Henley from the Chicago University. One of the things that's going to be guiding our work is building on an opportunity to listen to students. One of the things that really was very impactful this year is that we got a volunteer group of students, 4 students from different universities, to begin to put together talking sessions with other students and with faculty around this issue of anti-racist pedagogy, right? We had begun to sort of think about how do we begin to look at the quality of doctoral programs. We have a quality guide that we were in the process of revising, and we wanted to begin to look at how do we incorporate an anti-racist pedagogy into the quality guide. How do we begin to incorporate a need to address white supremacy into the quality guide for doctoral programs? And a part of that process was us just listening to students, listening to doctoral students, BIPOC doctoral students, white students who were allies, about what they were seeing in their programs and what they thought needed to be addressed. And so one of the things I think is guiding our work this year is really stepping back and being very curious about the experiences of students, the experiences of faculty. We also were listening to what faculty were experiencing, BIPOC faculty in particular, and what they saw as what the needs were in the way in which we really changed the way we operate as doctoral programs, from admission to graduation, right? How are we supporting, how are we mentoring students? You know, in particular BIPOC students, because that was one of the things that really stood out for students is the lack of opportunities to be mentored, in particular be mentored by BIPOC faculty, but also the quality of mentoring they're receiving just in general. And many of them were telling horror stories about their experiences in some of our doctoral programs. And so one of the things that we're really going to be looking at very carefully this year is to continue to gather our understanding about students' experiences, and then using that information along with what we're gathering from faculty to then really begin to develop a quality guide for doctoral programs that will inform our sort of work in terms of our conferences and our mentoring of doctoral directors, to then really begin to sort of address some of these issues at the level of the preparation of the future scholars in our discipline.
Thank you so much. Dr. Joe, can you, and then we're going to take questions.
Sure.
Okay.
So I appreciate the challenge, but it's also, you know, we've been talking about this for a long time for many of us. And so I agree. One of the most important things that, as I'm beginning to consider when I'm stepping into the role of the president of the Society for Social Work and Research is, one, are we organized enough as an organization and as a profession to bring about some of the vision and changes that we've been talking about? So I've been in social work for a long time, and that's always been one of the key things. So a lot of what I'm hoping that we will be able to do collectively, and I do think the moment is now for this leadership, and as Gotham mentioned, that this leadership is preparing the next leadership to actually help us realize this, but we have to now usher in or further advance the infrastructure for the vision that we want. So I'm one who clearly believe, and I've learned this a long time ago, that societies are organized in ways to produce what we experience. Mm-hmm. So the quality of what we're experiencing right now is because we're organized and set up to do that. Mm-hmm. So if we're not able to move things along because we're not organized yet enough to move it along. So now I think we have a chance to further our ability to organize ourselves, to join in strategic collaboration, radical strategic collaboration, and those things will work. But in SWR, I'm going to take a look internally. Are we organized to make sure we advance social work science in a way that proposes solutions to complex issues, and getting those solutions into the hands of those individuals who make policy decisions or who make practice decisions? How well are we prepared to do that? And I want to work with my colleagues both in all the organizations and on the ground to make sure that we advance science that helps us present a new vision for how we live together, how we live more equitably together, how we live, and I use words that most scientists don't use, with love and with joy and with support. So those things are going to be critical for me, and I'm comfortable talking in that way. I'm going to use one of the most important things in my life is my faith to talk about my faith. I'm not saying you have to have my faith, but I'm not afraid to talk about that and say, how does that relate to the science, about how we support people, support their aspirations, support their health, their development, to help them heal, grow, and thrive. All those things are critically important. So as we're looking at in the face right now of an effort to reinforce the drivers of inequality and white supremacy, because that's the moment we're in. Mm-hmm. So some think we're in this moment of just awakening. I'm thinking we're in this moment of retrenchment. Mm-hmm. And what Martin Luther King said in 1969 at the APA address, when he says, scientists, you have to begin to help those who've been perpetrators of white supremacy and violence, just use the words that's involved with this, and violence and attempted genocide, you have to help them adjust to this new society. And we have to understand their experiences as well, so we can figure out how to intervene appropriately, because Why does this perpetuate intergenerationally? These are not the same individuals. This is the sons and daughters of those who perpetuated those ideas. So we have to figure out how we deal with that. And we use clarity, as Gotham said, we have to be very clear. I talk about racism, I talk about hate, I'm talking about caste systems, social caste systems. I'm talking about skin color. I want to use the language that does not support white supremacy or eugenics sort of thinking. So I think right now, organize, do an assessment to see do we have the ability to produce the results we want, be relentless, because many of us, there are many moving parts, but we don't follow through deep enough, long enough, sustained enough to achieve the outcomes. So how do we build upon all the great energy at the local level, at the policy level that's out there to really be very focused on, for me, advancing science in ways that helps provide a vision for how we live together, better serve each other, and help us heal, grow, and thrive. So that's really where I'm going next.
Wow. This has just been so powerful, and we're going to take questions now because I know our listeners audience is probably frustrated that it's not as interactive as we want, but this just is so needed. This in itself is a lesson. Is a lesson.
And as
So
we
go
as
ahead,
we move
Gary.
as we move in that, I've been thinking on my walk this morning that we need to really learn the lessons of the cicadas. And if we really think about the cicadas, to some people are a nuisance. To me, they're strategists. They
Mm,
figure out what they need to do to survive, and they have been surviving cycle after cycle after cycle because they understand how the system works. They understand who the predators are. They
mm.
understand when they need to emerge. They understand how to shed the things that no longer serve them. There are lessons to be learned from the cicadas for all of us as we move forward in this journey. And it's not to be intermittent, it's to go deep, and it is to be strategic. So, questions.
Question. So we have Elena Gormley. Thank you, Elena, for asking, does this anti-racist action plan include a timeline for mandatory paid internships requiring students to work for free for 1 to 2 years effectively cuts off social work education for anyone who does not have intergenerational wealth? Extensive research has demonstrated that Black Americans have been systematically cut off from intergenerational wealth. If this action plan does not address the material exploitation of unpaid internships, it will not be effective. D- does anyone want to respond to that? One thing I say about a lot of the institutions that give scholarships and have generations of scholarships, perhaps they should look at how to deliver those scholarships to people who could do exactly what you said, Sean. To sometimes we have these things where we have all of this money at some of our predominantly white institutions where it's easy to go to those institutions because people get a whole full ride. Well, how do we make sure that those who need to be in the communities get those full rides?
Well, my understanding is there is a movement to work toward people being able to get credit for their internships in their work. So if you're working in a social work capacity, that is something that has been a challenge for a lot of the students who are working students in the inner city, that they have to work full-time jobs, raise children in the evenings, try to find internships, which are difficult to obtain. I mean, it's hard for us. I manage $20 million worth of programs, but it's hard to get the kind of oversight that you need on the weekends and in the nighttime. So my understanding, and it is moving in that direction. And I definitely think, I listened to what Dr. Joe said, and what really needs to be challenged, by a lot of our PhD students are these evidence-based practices. These evidence-based practices have very little evidence in communities of color, and they are accepted as fact that because it works for white people, it automatically works in the Black community without experiencing the same trauma that we've experienced, not experiencing the same history of racism and the generational trauma. So we have to change, in these kind of paradigms prevent people from getting reimbursed for services because you're not using models that have demonstrated effectiveness in communities that you don't even serve. So how do we as social work leaders look at that and say, hey, is something wrong with those practices? And as he said about faith, you know, what about the principles in Nguza Saba? What about those African-centered principles that have sustained us through oppression that have not been accepted as evidence-based practice, but have been able to survive middle passage, have been able to survive oppression and racism in this country? So I really believe we need to really change the dynamics of who is the authority on what works in the community.
One thing that I would even say with that is, as we look at our St. Louis group and
Mhm.
all of these groups that go out and find money, you know, there are people give, corporations give. So how do we come along? And Dr. Joe, you made me just think about this. How do we get ourselves the necessary dollars into our institutions that will give people money for internships, for education? Money is out there in the corporate sector. And I think, how do we realign, and maybe, you know, that thing of looking at our organizations, how can we work differently about going after that money?
Right. Right. I think I would also add to this. This is the time to also interrogate the model upon which our profession is built.
Mm-hmm.
And our model was built for white women who had certain economic access. Jane Addams was not Poe.
Mm-hmm. No, she was very no.
Mary Richmond was, and had a whole lot of problems with poor people as well, if we really think about displacement. But what we really see is we have a model that was created not for the student of today, but for students of the past who were rarefied even then amongst population because they didn't represent Latino women, Asian women, Native American women. So we've got to interrogate the model because we keep retrofitting today's practice on yesterday's model. And I also want to caution that not everyone, because of the color of your skin, is immediately socioeconomically deprived. And I think we've got to be really careful sometimes about that being the placeholder. And I know Mitt and I've had this conversation.
Yes.
I went to school and graduate school and other things without debt. And I'm lucky. I know I was lucky. But I didn't come out with that same debt. And so I think that I don't want us to always make the assumption that this equals that.
Right.
Because that also tracks people in certain ways as well. I just need to say both of those things.
Yes, very clear, because not all African Americans need assistance to go to school. And some people make that as if that is the case. And just recently, Gary and I had a talk about that because someone said, I know Mitt and I have a student loan debt. And I'm like, no, I don't have any. My father paid for my education. You know, it was fully paid for. So we can't make all of these assumptions because everyone needs assistance. Gary, do you want to take this question and throw it out at someone?
Sure. This is from Kim Tran. In general, what will an anti-racist NASW social work profession look like in terms of demographics, testing, licensing, education, continuing education, etc.? How will we know when the goals are achieved? That's a multi-part question. Some of those things don't belong with NASW, the testing. So you've heard the conversation with Dr. Cheesley about ASWB,
Right.
CSWE, et cetera. So Dr. Joe, Dr. Farmer, Dr. Haley.
I want to jump in on two things, if I can. Well, a couple of things that was said. So one, Dr. Haley was correct that in order to advance the care of people of color, we had a movement called the Civil Rights Movement that led to the production of or the training of more faculty of color. Then we had the Reagan era, which then led into the reduction of the infrastructure that supported more faculty of color, so who are doing science. So we do have to advance critical treatments that's been designed for and developed and tested with people of color. So that's a scientific priority that we have to advance. But at the same time, in doctoral training, we have to end kind of racist methodology training and how we do that in theory and in practice. So those are important things to say. How do you end racializing methodology? So that's an important topic to address. With the infrastructure, and I think Dr. Bailey, you said it best, We're trying to use the old model, which is built on a different population, and we haven't revised the model as a profession. So I think what you have done here, Dr. Joyner, we have to have this common table to really say what's the new model, given the priorities. And that student was right, because you have agencies who cannot, some of them can't afford to pay our students.
Right.
So what's going to be the right economic model, and for whom we have to be intentional about designing that. So intentionality is such a big thing for us going forward, and relentlessness is the other one. So we have to be able to do that work to move that forward. And then that anti-racist vision, if first of all, demographically has to represent all those who are interested in social work, who are interested in the value of social work. And as we talked a little bit on the front end of the preparation, and Mick, I think I'm gonna use your example that you said. So if there was a Donald Trump person head of one of the leading social work organizations, would that work? Imagine that. If we're a profession that would allow that level of hate and vitriol, then we have lost our way.
We're going to take one more question, and then okay.
I'm just trying to see if
go ahead, Gary, while the question's being put up. Go ahead and say what
yeah, I think it's also going to be really important for us as we think about the whole role of unpaid labor in this country in general, because that's the macro discussion that we need to be having. And that goes from sports. And so these discussions are not, and we're really looking at unpaid labor of people who are there to do tasks. So NCAA, we can look at all of this and look at that unpaid labor force where we're making money for others, and that's historic. So we're making money for others that people don't benefit from. So it's a much broader model question. Dr. Judith Crocker, hello, Judith. This week here in Georgia, the governor has begun to advocate for the halting of public school educators to teach any issues, instructions, or language related to CRT, critical race theory, via the school boards. How should we as social workers respond, Dr. J? And so I would open this up. My comment is, I'm so tired of people who don't understand what something is talking about it. If I hear one more person talk about cancellation culture who doesn't know what they're talking about, a critical race theory, or what they're talking about, a black life. But your comments.
No, Gary, go on. Finish that, because that's where we have to be.
You don't have a clue what critical race theory is. If what you want to do is maintain the status quo, that's critical race theory. So you're not doing anything. You're saying that white supremacist thought is the way that things go, and that white supremacy, misogyny, all of those, someone talked about social constructs. They're all social constructs. Mm-hmm. They've all been made up.
Dr. Bailey, I'm with you.
You talk about a social construct.
Cancel hate, cancel white supremacy. I think this is a direct attack and pushing on not only schools of social work, but higher education, particularly what they call progressive or liberal higher education. Right. And the idea that we should no longer talk about the evils in our past, highlight just the good things. So I do think we got to push back hard on this. It's a really attack. We're seeing it now in school districts, as this person indicate, that they're saying you can't teach about slavery unless you talk about slaves as workers.
Right.
Slaves as workers.
And happy. And
happy and employed.
And happy slaves.
What's happening to Nicole Hannah Jones in North Carolina. These are the moments when you push back against the messenger. It always says to me that you are on message, stay on message, because people don't push back on what's not correct.
Right.
Yeah, I think the other thing too, we have to also highlight that this is not a U.S. phenomenon.
No, not at all.
No. I mean, you look at some of the stuff in Great Britain. The universities in Great Britain are struggling with the same issue of this pushback on teaching critical race theory, right? So I think that we need to also help sort of contextualize that this white supremacy is not a U.S. phenomenon. Right?
Not at all.
It's a worldwide phenomenon, right? And I think that's a part of our sort of challenge, right? Is how do we continue to educate people that this is not just about interpersonal feelings, but it is about a systemic structure that has a history that predates all of us and predates this nation, right? Itself.
And
So I am going to have to cut us off because it's almost time for us to go, but I am going to invite you back, maybe even bring in a panel at something that we do at NASW I have going on in my head, because this is really needed. I want everyone to understand that the Essential Chats for MIT is not to end with this turning this off. I need you now as our listeners to go out in our communities, play this tape to everybody, and begin to have this conversation, because I am telling you now that this group of leaders will shift the paradigm. Either you're with us or you're without us, but we must shift the paradigm. Thank you all, and I'll see you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.